for coming to the Ryan Institute seminar on AI and, or sorry, what is it called? AI and innovation. Here we have John Horton visiting us today from MIT Sloan. He's an economist. He studies information system, market design, labor economics, or economics, a whole basket of topics, many of them related to digitization, AI, and things like that. So we're very happy to have him today. We're going to go for an hour and 15, so it takes us to 2:45.
Great, thanks so much. Wow, leading off with applause. Thank you. Very kind. I hope I can keep it up. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I really excited to tell you a little bit about what I've been up to with two of my students, Ben and Dayan. So my clicker is not working now. I did test this. Oh. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so I think like a canned view of what most of us are doing as social scientists or researchers is we're doing something like we're generating hypotheses, we're running experiments, or we're trying to look for data that approximates an experiment. We're analyzing results and kind of never-ending cycle. And like a lot of you, we're probably thinking right now, like, hey, there's a lot going on in the world of technology. Where can we kind of speed things up or make this process go better? And, there's been a lot of work, I would say, focus on this hypothesis generation step. There's a whole bunch of papers that are saying, hey, is there some way we can take data that we have and detect anomalies and come up with explanations? And, a lot of work in this space. There's been, I would say, relatively less, but a growing body of literature focusing on how do we actually run something that looks like experiments or does something empirical. And one advantage we have in the social sciences is that we can potentially simulate the people that are participants that are kind of like supposed to be subjects in the experiment. How well this works, we'll talk more about it. But just to fix ideas, imagine that you have an LLM and you give it some persona, like an agent's gonna have this persona. Ben, this isn't you, you're not slightly annoying.
I thought it'd going to be annoying, or maybe more annoying than I already am, if I could be 29. That would be good. So.
It also says you have very low standards. In case you haven't figured, this is actually made by my student Ben. I'm not like running him down in a public talk. But the idea is, okay, we've created this persona, and then we can do things with this persona and say, oh, how would you feel about this lottery, or what are your public opinions on some policy question, or things like that. And there's kind of like a lot of people that are doing versions of this now. And it's got some nice advantages. Sometimes it seems to work, sometimes it doesn't work. I'll talk more about this in a bit. But one interesting thing that you can also do is not just kind of take one agent in isolation, but have them interact and actually replicate, simulate social phenomena, not just sort of like a one-off investigation. And so there's a bunch of papers, and I have one kind of in the genre of doing this, running these simulations. Let me just like a slight detour on this topic. So this was my version of this, which is when GPT-3 was kind of the state of the art. I was playing around with it and I said, hey, I wonder what would happen if we just gave it some classic results, classic experiments from behavioral economics, just like the simplest thing you could imagine. What would happen? It seemed sort of sophisticated enough that this would work. I would be very reluctant to use the word replicate. What this really kind of just showed was that concepts that we would kind of recognize as either economic or something about social preferences would kind of get translated into how these things would sort of play these kind of classic games. So I try to lean on my high school Latin and say, hey, we have this like homo economicus idea in economics, which is this. We take this maintained model of human behavior, rationally pursues objectives, unlimited computation, unlimited memory, And then most applied theory is, hey, let's take and put this in different scenarios, right? If you're a labor economist, you have Homo economicus looking for a job or hiring people. If you're, want to put them and make them an investor or a trader, you're doing finance. And what I kind of think what this gave us as researchers is not like a new way of doing empirics. Like I very strongly don't think that this is empirics. It's more like how we can use models to kind of explore a space. And we can say, hey, instead of this maintained model of human behavior where it solves these first order conditions, it's a computational model. And rather than kind of presuppose that this is what it does whatever the model predicts is likely to happen in this context. And then I can go and do the same kinds of things I was doing before. Now, I mean, for this to work in any sense, this has to be a good model. And we'll talk more about like how to get it closer to approximating humans. But this is kind of what I think is useful about this approach. It's like a tool for exploring things, just like economists use theory to think about things where they can't run an experiment or they don't have like the perfect data on something yet. So just to give a very simple example, there's this great paper, it's kind of an oldie but goodie, it's by Danny Kahneman, Jack Netch, and Richard Thaler, where what they did was they just had this observation that people have intuitions or moral judgments about prices changing depending on context. And so people feel differently about a price rising, say, because you're kind of taking advantage of someone versus something like maybe there's a supply shock or something like that. So the paper is a bunch of really simple experiments where they just presented little vignettes to people and said, hey, is this morally right, morally wrong? What are your feelings? So the first question in the paper is a hardware store has been selling snow shovels for $15. The morning after a large snowstorm, the store raises the price to $20. Please rate this action as completely fair, acceptable, unfair, and very unfair. Just that quick show of hands, how many people think this is totally fine? I do this every time. Like there's such huge variance in how people answer this. Like you do it with management consultants. It's fun. But when they did this original study, 82% of respondents said this is not cool. You can't jack the price up after a snowstorm like this. Okay, well, let's do the same thing to the OpenAI API as it existed circa 2023. The experiment here is pretty simple. We're going to just create a function that will try a new price. We'll do something that's not in the original experiment and say, hey, I want you to play a role of a person with certain political commitments. And I had this intuition that maybe the word changes versus raises might matter. And so I gave myself a little bit of flexibility to adjust like the exact language. So here's where I can do neutral or not. Notice I can type in a new price, right? The original experiment said, hey, this was from this price to this. We actually have the luxury, like let's try different prices and sort of see if that changes around people's moral judgments. And then lastly, this kind of very explicit, like this is who you are. These are your sort of political views. So this, like everyone who's doing these kind of LLM experiments is kind of doing some version of this, of like writing a script and saying, hey, this is the role that you're going to play. So, when I did this is the original experiment. And then here, just a tiny little $1 increase, or we'll sort of like really jack up the price. And then here's the political orientations of this is not part of the original experiment. So I'm saying, oh, you're a conservative, you're a liberal, whatnot. And then here's just the people who said it was acceptable, unfair, or very unfair. And I had the temperature set to 0. So I'm just going to show you just its literal response to this question. So if you make a libertarian, a robot libertarian, they're okay with the price increasing. But even then, they have their limits. As you start to go to the really large price increases, you can even tip Ayn Rand into unfair. If you start with a robot socialist, you already start at unfair, but you still get that kind of price unfairness gradient as you sort of kick them further. Now, when I did this, I saw, hey, look, conservative actually is unfair right from the get-go. And I was thinking like, well, maybe it's something about the language conservative, maybe there's like kind of like this delta between libertarian and conservative, or maybe this is just like totally an artifact of the models and it's sort of nothing here. I'm not, and neither of you, like none of you here is actually interested in snow shovel studies, right? I guess. Well, this is like close to shit, I don't know, maybe. But like the point is, just kind of from the comfort of my own laptop, I found an anomaly that I could like maybe think is worth further study. And I think that the reason I highlighted is I think that this is the kind of thing that is useful. Like you have a tool you can play around with, and you can see something in simulation that might be worth pursuing more seriously, either with a real experiment or some kind of follow-up. So, does this replicate? I kind of think I put it in scare quotes because I don't think it's quite the right word. I've done this exact same question for lots of different groups, and you sort of get very different answers depending on the group. And that also is very true with LLMs. Like that being said, you do that gradient of like liberal versus conservative shows up, and they are sensitive to the price. So I think that's probably something that like is true in the world and also kind of shows up in the LLMs. And so I would say that, if you wanted to actually quantitatively replicate, like, oh, we'll get the exact same thing, you'd have to find the same population. As Richard Thaler saw this, I tweeted about it, I tweeted about everything, and was saying that, well, when they actually did it, they just had to fax the question off to some survey firm that did it. And I thought it was just interesting because it was a huge hassle to do this kind of work. And so, my life here was much, much simpler. But so you might think, well, hey, aren't these just memorizing results? Like maybe, that paper was certainly in the training corpus. Is it just kind of regurgitating, like it knows what the right answer is? I think that it probably varies quite a bit on how famous the paper is. I think that there's probably a real opportunity to do some work to like try to quantify it. For certain applications, though, if it's memorizing sort of true social science findings about the world, memorization is kind of our friend, if we're kind of using it for prediction. But I'll talk more about that later. Another, is it influenced by, reinforcement learning from human feedback and all the other like post-training stuff that they do? Absolutely. But you can work around this. And plus, I think the answer is the future is probably open source, where we're using models for social science purposes, where we are the ones who train them and we sort of understand how they work. These things are unlike real humans in various ways. Sure, absolutely. This is 100% true. But for certain kind of questions, like we don't think it matters, right? If you think about how much of behavioral econ is built on the foundation of getting undergrads into a lab, like why are we okay with that? Well, we kind of think because the things we're exploring are like very general features of human psychology or human behavior. Now that isn't always true. You can find places where that's like a leaky abstraction, but like in a lot of times that is the case. I think finally, forget kind of these theory arguments. There are papers where people are running experiments with LLMs where the results of that experiment aren't in the training corpus, like provably not in the training corpus. And you're getting people essentially like front running lab studies. Not always, like there's cases where this doesn't work, but at least there seems to be certain domains where this approach, you can essentially predict things that real humans will do using this kind of method. Okay, so that was quite a detour, but let's just presuppose that this idea, it works in some sense, like it matches what real humans do, maybe with some probability, or at least in some domains. So if we go back in the cycle, the last one is analyzing results, but what's beautiful, if you actually have a true experiment, this one is often the easy one. It's, all the difficult econometric stuff happens when you don't have a nice clean experiment. So this may be the simple one. So, I kind of characterize it as people working on different parts of these kind of nodes here. And the question that motivated this paper was, hey, could we actually try to automate this whole thing? Could we kind of like create a system that could do every step of this along the way without a human in the loop? And I'll talk about why we thought that would be a useful thing to do, but that's what we set out to try to do. Right?
I guess if we were to like stick up for our theory colleagues in the building, I would say like this is that step that you might replace in this sort of pre-running of an experiment would be like what we would have done traditionally with just a rational agent model, and you would sort of write down your sort of formulation, and then you would get some predictions, and then you would take that to an experiment, right? So it's like what do we gain, I guess, by running things in this sort of like quasi-experimental state, and because it's a black box, like is that easier or harder to like learn from before you run an experiment?
But that's a great question. I mean, I would say, and my slide is not running down theorists. I would say that it's an homage theory, right? It's a useful exercise, like lets you make predictions. I would say it's probably that very often we're trying to make predictions about, say, some study that we might do, and we know that there's other contextual factors, and there's kind of a little bit of like modeling, a free parameter, like what things do I think is important here? Like what information should I assume people have? Like what is the objective function I'm giving them? And so, those are kind of like researcher choices that you would have to make. I think this would let you be a little bit more empirical about it. Like, hey, let me describe the situation to you. Here's the choices you can make. I don't have to like write down a first order condition that I think you're solving. I can just be empirical about it. I mean, I think ultimately, you want to make the kind of theories that you're talking about. But if I'm planning a study or trying to do some simulation, in some sense, it's nice if I can just be empirical, right? I don't have to kind of commit necessarily to like, oh, this is the right model for use here. Yeah.
So when I'm thinking of an experiment, I think of the control group and the experimental group.
Yeah.
Where's the control group in this?
You will see it in it.
Who doesn't get the treatment?
Well, I would think of it as like vaccine trials, but like say I'm trying to understand the effects of price on whether or not you think it's okay to raise whether like how much do you raise the price? Does that affect your beliefs about the morality? I would say you're experimentally manipulating the price. Which one's the control, which one's the treatment?
That everyone gets a change in price.
Everyone gets a different price. Yes. So I've induced exogenous variation in something that is on the right-hand side. So it's definitely like, yeah, it's an experiment.
No, although just yeah, the other thing about an experiment is you're going to try to control everything else except the treatment.
No, randomization solved that for us.
So exactly, but how do you like?
I mean, you're still creating. You still have ignorability. You're still creating like a group that has X set here, and another group that has X set at another value. So, is it? So you're not.
So I'm thinking the computer gets into its memory balance, it's pulling off some data, and each time it does that, it grabs potentially samples that have a lot of overlap or no overlap with each other, and so. One sample is looking at a change in price, the other sample is looking at a different change in price, but the other conditions of the data that the machine might be using to estimate a reaction could be different on other dimensions as well.
I mean, I think if you're doing inference on the same model, because it sounds like what you're worried about is like a violation of IID, right? These aren't draws from the same distribution.
Not really. Every time the model goes in, if you ask ChatGPT a question today, gives you an answer. You ask it the same question tomorrow, gives you a different answer.
Well,
it's drawing on different.
No, I mean I think no, but so here we're using through the API. Now you're taking OpenAI's word for it, but like within a narrow window of time, you're getting draws from the same model. I mean, you can see this very clearly if you use the open model. Like if you were using Llama. It is a deterministic process. If it's not, it's a random process, but it is still frozen weights and frozen input process. you're kind of raising a like, you can't step into the same stream twice, and you can. Right, they are ideal. That's what we can see that.
Well, maybe related to my question, so going back to your conservative libertarian,
Yeah.
it seemed like it was giving you the same answer, there was no variance.
The temperature was set to 0. So it doesn't make sense to do multiple draws in the temperature to 0. If you set the temperature higher, you'll get a distribution of responses.
Would this relate to the point about whether you're really the same thing or not?
No, it's just about, so you have the output layer, right, of like, hey, what's the next token that it's going to predict? If you set the temperature to 0, it's just going to choose the next token that has the highest probability. As you turn the temperature up, you're sampling over that. And so you get this non-determined, like you get this stochasticity in responses. But you could actually just look at, like, if say it was just like a binary thing, you actually get the probabilities rather than the responses. But it's not. It's a little weird compared to like what we're used to, where it's a person saying something. It's the same model, but the kind of like how you calculate like the mean between two groups is not different. It's the same. If the temperature is 0, it doesn't make any sense because you're just going to deterministically get the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I don't want to be reality too much, but would your recommendation be to look at the distribution to better understand how it varies?
I mean, I think you it's a little bit weird if you're trying to do like a multi-step thing, then you kind of have to say, oh, like, well, all right, you really want to like sort of trace out a tree of like, well, when this is this, what came next, what came next. For these ones where it's just like fair, unfair, you could just look at like what is the probability of like the fair token, unfair, whatever. So you could inspect the token probabilities directly. A lot of I think we are kind of getting down into the weeds, but you can do that. You can look at what the model says is the probability of like what was this token was going to come back.
Well, we don't need to do that.
Not for this. No, I don't think we do. So the question is like, could we take and try to do this whole thing in an automated way? So the idea we had for this system was that I create a system where I could give it a social science topic that I cared about. The model would generate a hypothesis. The model would design experiments to test that hypothesis. It would generate agents as experimental subjects. It would run the experiment with independent LLM subjects playing the roles that were laid out for it. So we could collect the data from whatever simulation we did, analyze the results, and then use the fitted model in some way to make predictions. So this is what we were trying to do. So essentially just tell us the area we're interested in, and then we go off and do what we're supposed to do. And so how it kind of works, I'll go through each piece. The open-ended description of some social science scenario are things, and this is what we do in the paper, say 2 people bargaining over an item, or a job interview, or a legal proceeding, or an auction. That's like at the level of which you kind of kick off the process. Like, this is the thing I'm interested in. Then what it tries to do is tries to draw a structural causal model of that situation. And what it does is it's trying to say what's a outcome we care about, and what are causes we might care about in that situation. So what this economists don't really like directed acyclic graphs. Computer scientists sort of love them as like a model of causal inference. But we found it to be very useful because it gives us this data structure to express these like cause and effect ideas, and it gives us a blueprint for designing the agents that we're going to. So if we say, hey, this is a cause, then we know that this is something the agent has to vary on. And the nice thing too is it gives you this mechanistic way of analyzing the data. If you can just fit that model, there's kind of no art left once you sort of specify the model. So to make this more concrete, imagine 2 people bargaining over a mug. You can ask the LLM, hey, 2 people are bargaining over a mug, what's an outcome people might care about in this situation? And so, you could kind of do this with any of your favorite models. And, it'll come up here. This is, maybe what economists would care about. It'll say things like, oh, agreement price, whether a trade occurs, the split of surplus, bargaining power. That's not really a great outcome. How long the negotiation takes. Like, these are all like things that might be of interest. Okay. So you can go in other places with this, like you could ask it to sort of be creative and unconventional. You could say you're a sociologist, you're a computer scientist, you're whatever it is, but the idea is you're trying to get something that you're going to look at, right? The key point I just want to emphasize, and it's that the system is going to be asking all of these questions as we go. So we just set the domain. We're not involved in what happens afterwards by design. So if you do bargaining, the system said whether or not a deal occurs. That's a totally reasonable thing that you might care about in a bargaining situation. And then once you fix that, then you go through this process and say, what things do you think might cause a deal to happen or not? And here the model is leaning on the fact that it knows a lot about the world and would say, well, the seller's reservation price is going to matter a lot, or the buyer's interest in this thing is going to matter. It knows enough about our world that it's going to come up with non-crazy potential causes. Okay. And so, again, if you do this kind of, hey, in this outcome, in this situation, what are potential causes? You can see capable models will come up with lots of things that seem quite plausible, and you could point to papers that would kind of investigate that precise thing. So once you kind of pick some of those, and you could kind of decide how complex you want the model to be, again, you go back to the model and say, hey, we're looking at this outcome, this cause. How are we actually going to like operationalize this? Like, we're asking the model to say, hey, we're going to vary this. What might we how might we do that? So a buyer's budget, the model might say, oh, it's going to be the dollar value of their willingness to pay, right? That's how you operationalize this idea. You would say, well, is this continuous or is this categorical? Hey, what might be some reasonable ranges? And it's basically going through the same process. If you were trying to design a bargaining experiment, you would have to do very similar things. Like, I'm going to give you an endowment. I'm going to give you a little card that says how much you value this thing, and that's what you're going to use when you bargain. So it's doing that same process. What's nice about that is once you know all the potential causes, and you know the range in which they're supposed to vary, you can now completely specify that whole cross of the explanatory variables, and you know the experiment you would need to run to identify all of those paths. So once you've got those agents, then you can take and have them go and interact with each other. So in the bargaining case, they would say, we would give them, the model would say, what is your goal here, and some constraints that might be sensible. But then the thing that we vary are going to be part of its description. So in the same way when I said the snow shoveling example, like, hey, you're a libertarian, you're a conservative, whatever, it's like, oh, your value is this. This is your sort of love. Or if you're on the seller side, this is how attached you are, say, to this something. Okay. So then you can have these agents, they can go back and forth. They create essentially a transcript, right? And this is what it looks like. These are actual transcripts. They're very polite to each other. They're not realistic in important ways. But this is what they do. And the simulation here, this is where it gets expensive. We end up launching hundreds or thousands of these simulated conversations between agents, because that's what we're going to need to identify these paths. So you have the thousands of AI conversations take place. Then we really kind of struggled with, like, how would we actually measure if our outcome happened? right? Like what, like we have to go through the transcript and find, and then we kind of like, I think Ben had kind of a genius idea, which he said, well, look, why don't we just give them as memory what just happened and then ask them about the outcome. And then they could look and see, like, yes, did a deal happen, or what was the price? And what we do is kind of ask every agent that participated in the study the outcome question. And if we got agreement, like, yep, they all agree that a deal took place or a deal didn't take place or whatever the price was. So once you do that, you can just go and say, did you buy the mug? Buyer says no. Did you buy the mug? The buyer says yes. And so now I've got all my X's and I've got all of my Y's. So I have the outcome measured in each situation. And then that's everything I need to go fit the model that I specified up here in stage 1. Right? Like that part is just mechanical. Okay. So let me just show like what happens. Let me specifically do the 2 people bargaining over a mug. The outcome was that does a deal happen? And the proposed causes was the buyer's budget, the seller's minimum price, and the seller's love for the mug. I don't like the model that it came up with, because this seemed like this should be sort of incorporated into this, but we kind of wanted to let it be a bad simplifying place.
So just to clarify,
Yeah.
on the process here, how much again were you involved in like kicking off the next step, or was there also an agent like?
No,
doing all this,
everything,
like what?
the only input from us was 2 people bargaining over a mug, and everything else happened.
After that, the agent is even taking it from step to step.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything.
That's right. I mean, yeah, I mean, that, you know.
You had to like tell like the scope of the, I mean, you're presumably paying for these requests, right? So like, did you hand it your wallet or anything?
No, I mean, we had an API key and it ran the experiment that it designed. There were some that were like, nope, stop that, that's too much money, but not the bargaining one. But
You did give it some constraints then.
no, it wasn't a financial constraint. It was more like, hey, we only have 3 causes, which is that, I mean, it's implicit a financially constraint, but we did bake in the complexity of how big these trees could be.
But I do think that's, I mean, that's not like I'm not asking that only as like a logistics question or something, but like in practice, like, the research process also involves costs and benefits. And I wonder how much you're sort of thinking about that as you design this process.
Oh, I think like a non kind of prototypey academic version of this, like what you would really do is you would see what it was going to propose and you would go X out things and be like, I'm not interested in this, or actually you're missing this hypothesis, or like this should be symmetric. So even though you kind of set full autonomy as a goal, I think how you would use this in practice is probably much more interactive. So let's look at the back and forth. So this is like after the fact, we can look at all these bargaining scenarios. And so I'm going to arrange them. These are cases where the seller's valuation was low. These are where the seller's valuation was high. This is when the buyer's valuation was low and the buyer's valuation is high. And so here we have each round of the back and forth. And so this was us going through the transcripts and extracting all this stuff. This is not, we don't get this for free. And then what I'm going to plot is the offer price either from the buyer or the seller. So and what you have here is this range is like where a deal could have happened. And then the blue and the black here are the price trajectories of the 2 sides. And then if the deal was struck, you see a green. And so when you do this, what you notice is that basically everywhere where a deal could have been struck, the 2 agents came to agreement. In the cases where it was like a precise like tie, they also seemed to come to an agreement. And when they couldn't come to an agreement, for the most part, they did not, except for this exception. Right. So here was a place where shouldn't have been possible for them to have a deal. Their values were not, there was no space where they could strike a deal. So we're like, what happened? Well, you dig into the transcripts and you see that what happened was, they said, I have a few items that might interest you in addition to my $6. Would that be acceptable to you? So like the agent like created a side deal. That you know wasn't part of our design, and that's how they kind of came to an agreement. Depending on your perspective, this is either like a bug or a feature of this system. When I like talk to people who've actually done empirical work in bargaining, they said, "Oh, this is actually super common. People try to like propose side deals all the time. If you do experiment on eBay, you'll see all these side deals." You know, I didn't know that. We didn't build it. We didn't build this experiment, but it wasn't sort of part of what we were doing. I kind of view this as a like, hey, surfacing considerations that you had. Like, hey, if you're going to design an exploration of bargaining, you should consider the fact that your agents might try to do this. And so you either say it's not possible, or you build in a mechanism that allows it in some way. You know, so you might think like, why does this work? Why does it create a reasonable simulacrum of bilateral bargaining? Well, you know, one is that the model knows how to bargain because it read Nash 1953. It knows about gradual convergence from the Splockus and Steve Fidelis paper, but curiously, it doesn't know about Rubenstein 1983, where you're supposed to immediately come to. I don't think that that's what's going on. I think the alternative possibility is that the training corpus just contains an unfathomably large amount of data and includes people talking about bargaining, and it knows this like sort of back and forth. Like, oh, I propose and you propose and we meet in the middle, and all this kind of stuff is essentially in its like world model. And that's if you put them two together, you'll recreate what it looks like when people bargain, at least in broad strokes, right? Now, I mean, like, is this like empirically how people actually bargain? It actually looks pretty similar to what people do on eBay. You do get this kind of gradual conversion. But you know, I don't think you want to say, oh, this is like the point prediction of it. It just gives you a way of simulating something that looks like bargaining, you know, without bringing people into the lab.
Which model is this?
This was GPT-4.
I feel like when you look at the negotiation games, the reasoning models perform in a very different way. I don't want to see that.
So we didn't use any of the reasoning models, at least like not in this work, but I mean, I could imagine them. You could end up getting like much more sophisticated gameplay.
Yeah, at least my own experience feel like the reasoning model seems like doing, like I can see like for all, for example, is doing what you're saying, like it's just your model and almost like emulating what happens on eBay, but the reasoning model seems like they're really dialed in on how do I think about Patna, how do I think about, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like you raise an interesting question, which is, if you are trying to model a social science scenario where you think people are very sophisticated, these like advanced reasoning models are your friend. Like if I was imagining like, oh, I want to model like a trader, you know, or someone who's doing like something very sophisticated versus someone kind of like, you know, yeah, sure, I'll buy a snow shovel or not. You know, the amount of sophistication of the model actually ends up being quite useful. I'll show it later in the talk, but there's a paper Ryan Oprea shows it's about prospect theory. The argument in the paper is that a lot of it maybe is driven by people making mistakes. And you can show that with like simpler models, it shows the same patterns he finds in his behavior. Like it looks like Llama in some sense like acts in a behavioral way, but GPT 4.0 and above just like straight up plays expected utility maximization. It doesn't show prospect theory type tendencies. So I think that could be an argument for like the sophistication of the model probably depends on what kind of a situation are you trying to model. Is it one where you think that these like behavioral considerations are first order, or do you think it's something that like the environment like would really discipline it out and like you wouldn't see it? Yeah.
So I'm curious, you showed a very realistic interaction, but I'm curious about like how important or insightful that interaction was. And I know you're not claiming that particular one was, but I could imagine if you endowed them with a budget and then allowed them to spend their budget as they're doing these interactions, and also allowed them to gain items like coffee cups and whatnot, that it would get much closer to a prospect theory kind of, I don't know if that's where you're going kind of thing. But if you did all that kind of stuff, then when you have that false binary of like, here's my minimum price and here's my love, you can like remove that binary and have like, here's my budget, here's my price, here's my items that I think I like after I hold them. Is that the kind of stuff that we could get a model to then think about and then show something?
I mean, that's what I hope that we're able to do someday, that like you could have an idea and say, oh, you know what, it's really the free-form conversation is really driving these results. And if I force people to use a bidding language, you know, we would get very different results. And if I had this idea and all I had was a conventional lab, you know, like, oh, okay, $10,000 and 4 weeks later, we maybe have the first cut of data. If I could simulate that ahead of time, even if like I knew with some probability that was unrealistic, I think that that would be super useful in the research process. Like I would either be directed in things that are promising or kind of like talked away from things that are not promising. And so, you know, to the point I was raising earlier, like, yeah, we set it up in this entirely autonomous way, but I think the real payoff is that you could inject your ideas at any step. Yes.
I'm wondering about if we use this, something like this as at least part of sort of the steering mechanism towards things that are promising and things that maybe are less promising. Whether that steers us towards things that like we're more likely to kind of already know because they're sort of more likely to be in the training data,
or the opposite, where we're like, there's no reason to study this one because the LLM already predicts it. Like this isn't going to be marginal, like in the economic sense. But you go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess right. I could go in either direction, but I guess it's the gap between how good are these models at seeming like real people and how not, or it's like the probability that it's going to give us the kind of predictions we want, and presumably those probabilities are unequally distributed across domains and across, you know, different aspects of research design. That gap becomes really important.
Exactly.
Right?
No, I 100% agree. And I think that that's why the research program should be about how do you make agents where you narrow that gap? Like you think that, hey, I've created agent sets and a model such that I feel pretty confident that I can predict what's going to happen in this kind of situation, because I think it's covered by the same, you know, theory or data generating process or something, because then it becomes more useful. Like the less that that's true, the more likely it will like steer you in the wrong direction. Yeah.
So on that note of like the less that's true, the more it'll steer you in the wrong direction. I'm wondering about like we know that when we prompt large language models with like particular characteristics about people, especially in a short prompts, like say like I know I'm a Republican, it'll blow that up way more than like my latent experience feeling this way and like my kind of like I'm a whole person versus like you told the model to act on one particular perspective.
Yes.
So how do you
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, I think it's almost like this, like, you know, the Chekhov's gun quote. Like if there's a gun on the mantle, it has to get fired by the last act. Like if you say you're a Republican, like it is gonna work that into its answer in some way. I mean, I think a promising direction would be, we imagine like we have real data about how a real person answers. Like I've got 1,000 questions of how you answered the GSS. And then when I'm trying to use that to predict what you might do in some situation, I'm kind of doing this like knapsack process of trying to pull in the traits that I know to build a prompt that is likely to be on point for this particular context. So if I'm asking, you know, about like, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You know, like your political affiliation probably doesn't matter, but maybe stuff about like your religion and diet and health, like that's going to be sort of first order, and you'd want the model to like lean on that. But you know, but this I talk a little bit more about that, but I think that that's kind of the engineering challenge of like how do you build agents that are useful for the purpose you have, as opposed to like, hey, does this black box thing happen to be useful for the question? So, you know, you can take and estimate this model that gives you, you know, really shocking insights that like the higher the buyer budget, the more likely a deal happens. You know, as the seller's minimum price, you know, all the kind of the effects go the sort of the right way. The point is not that this is like, you know, exciting advances in mug studies. But you know, but like this is how it can just take that raw data and tell you at least signs. You know, one thing, you know, you don't, even though it's fitting the structural causal model, you don't actually have to kind of be beholden to that. So after the fact, fit a decision tree on this data, it gets this kind of like very ugly model. But you know, if you're an economist, you're like, well, I bet a deal is really a function of a gap in valuations. And sure enough, like that's the best model that you're going to find to predict like whether or not a deal happens. So you know, you can kind of do this sort of ex post data mining on your data to sort of see what's interesting. You're not kind of limited by, you know, whatever the SEM structure that I put on. You know, let's get to, you know, let's get to an example where a domain where economists are more confident they know what happens in the world than mug studies or bargaining rather. Bilateral bargaining is tough. Like, there's a lot of things that could happen, but we kind of think we know what happens in certain kinds of auctions. So this one, the input was 3 bidders participating in auction for a piece of art starting at $50. And here we actually did reach in and made all of the buyers symmetric. So this is not what it generated. It gave different buyers different valuation distributions, and we wanted it symmetric so we could more closely tie it to bargaining theory. So this is the case where we came in and changed things. So we made them all symmetric. It turned out to be an open ascending price auction with private values, in the sense that when you put them in this context and you said, hey, this is an art auction, it leaned on sort of its model of, oh, there's like an open cry auctioneer who's taking and calling on people. So one thing that kind of came out, so here's just the first bidder's reservation price, the second bidder's reservation price of 150, and then the third in column. If I had one more bidder, I couldn't do this kind of visualization. But what you see here is this is the empirical clearing price that can happen. In this auction, theory tells us what is supposed to happen. Each bidder here has a 1/3 chance of being marginal, and it's supposed to be the second highest valuation that's going to pin down the price. So we sort of know what kind of should happen. Here you can see, so here's an example: 200, 250, 100, and 300, and the clearing price is 250. That's what should happen with this option format. So here, what I'm doing here is just plotting the auction theory prediction against what actually happened, and you know, you get a very close matchup. When it's not, there's some cases where the bid increment was such that that's not what happened, but for the most part, you're like very, very close to what happened. And this is just across all of the data. You can see the theory prediction matches the empirics quite closely. One thing I want to just flag, you know, this is a case where our linear model actually couldn't have captured the real structural equation that was going on. Like, it can only draw straight lines in this graph. Like, that was how we set it up. That's kind of a limitation of this structural causal model thing, is that like there wasn't an obvious way that could have discovered the auction theory result with this structure. Everything had to be linear. Well, okay, so you get this good agreement between simulation and theory. But you might ask, like, does the LLM just know what will happen? Is all this simulation necessary? I would guess if you went to O3 or a reasoning model and described this situation, it would exactly tell you what would happen. Like that would be easy. When we originally wrote the paper, GPT-4 couldn't do this. We could describe the situation, say, hey, bidder 1 has this reservation price, bidder 2 has this reservation price, bidder 3 has this reservation price. Given this setup, what do you think the clearing price will be? So, you know, if you knew this auction format, you could work out this math, but GPT-4 at the time couldn't. So here in blue is its predictions about what would happen. So it's kind of all over the place, right? It just wasn't able to map between the setup and sort of what would happen. I think, you know, what's what's kind of important about this is we essentially just, by adding more computation to this problem, essentially setting up a simulation, having it actually go through the steps, collect the data, ask it, burning up, thousands of dollars of tokens, we actually get, a better prediction about what would happen, or like it's closer to what we know in this case would be the real world. So if you do this across the board, you get better prediction. One thing you can also do is kind of feed it back what it learned from the simulation and see if that can help. Now, as I said, like the structural causal model can't capture the true relationship here, so it's already a little bit not going to be sort of set up. But the idea is give it the exact same prompt with the same scenario, and we give it the fitted model that it learned from simulation, and say, hey, this is our description of the world. Now, what do you think the final clearing price will be? So, in a way, what we're trying to do is simulate the idea of like you run a bunch of simulations about the world, and you now use this as part of the predictions that you might make. And you can see it's not perfect. It can't, exactly get what happened, and I think that's not so surprising because the SCM couldn't, but it does quite a bit better than just the naive don't ask it conditioned upon anything. And so if you do across simulations, you do get this improvement from allowing it to essentially like simulate the setting that it was looking for. Yeah. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is this useful for? Like, what are you going to do with this, or what might we do with this? I think a couple of them already we kind of talked about. Running your experiments before you run them is kind of the most obvious use case. You can kind of find problems. How many people here just run experiments? I mean, have you ever run an experiment and you're like, we should have asked this? And it just always happens. Like I should have asked this other question, or we should have had this other cell. And so it's trying to take away some of that. Can we create agent sets that have known properties? And here, imagine I was studying eBay and I wanted to try some policy change. Could I use this sort of process and fiddle around with my agents until I got agents that looked like the kind of behavior, they have this sort of behavior that I would hope to use for my setting.
So can you comment on this? Because I think starting I think 3.5 or 2.4, it became very clear that I think role play is a very important part of this, and this role play seems like it is actually for a long time. I thought it was the most useful thing for this. But then, how much of headwinds do people face these days in peer review? And people like, I just don't believe it. So, like, what is it? I know the concept is shifting, like using agent sets, or like I'm going to prompt the agent with certain properties, and
I think it does get back to, so this is maybe apocryphal, but I think that this is true. Like in economics, there used to be sort of a bad bias against math. Like people didn't like mathematical arguments, and supposedly like Alfred Marshall, took all wrote the sort of the text version, but then like the math was sort of like pressed down because people thought it was like weird, and you should be able to express it, the same way John Stuart Mill would have expressed your ideas. But eventually, we got comfortable with it, and this was a useful thing. And actually, presenting these this way became in a mathematical argument became useful. I could imagine in the future, people are doing studies and people want to know, well, what's your reference agent for this human behavior, and what does the gap look like? I'm speculating, but I could imagine people start to this become sort of a standard thing that people do. I do think that. I don't think people are ever going to say, you discovered something with agents, great, let's write it up. We've now discovered something new about the world. I really do think it's like a tool for doing actual empirical work, that it makes empirical work better. And so, maybe at some point, people don't quite care what tools you use to do things. It's just becomes something useful to use.
So you're saying it's really piloting and prototyping.
Piloting, prototyping, point you in the right direction. possibly discovering things that then you go and turn out to be true. I mean, the idea of like doing automated drug discovery or something like that, and then, oh, well, they don't find something in silico and then say, okay, great, go ahead and start making it, we'll start treating people with it. Like, there's an empirical counterpoint, but I think we still have this idea that this is like a useful, the space of things is so vast that if we can explore it computationally first, we could kind of come up with like promising ideas. That's the idea. So I'm going to show you a diagram that looks insane, but I found to be useful maybe to think about some of this stuff. This is not the insane version. So there are things that are true about the social world, like that's the big green circle. There are things in the social science literature. That's the black circle. And
That's a large generous over.
no, these are not to scale. I don't offend anyone. Yeah, kind of. I'm sure you've all seen the news, kind of embarrassing for MIT.
Unless you probably found them.
I'm in Sloan. No,
I'm looking at them.
Yeah.
And then you also have things that are predicted by your AI agent simulations as they exist right now. Okay, so you could label these, right? So this might be a place where the LLM agent actually matches what's in the literature, but this is like not true. And that could either because it badly memorized some crappy social science, or it has a bad world model, right? It independently made the same mistake and sort of like learned the wrong thing. Here it's working. These are true things that are in the literature and are predicted by the agents, and that's either because it has a good world model or it's memorized things that it should have memorized. This is like the kind of exciting sweet spot would be things that are true. The AI agent will show you that they're true, but they're not in the literature yet. And this is where you need that good world model. Like it's figured something out that you just have to ask in the right way and you'll be able to extract that. And then this is where it's getting crazy. but these little humps are supposed to be us doing research, right? Where we're kind of pushing out the boundaries of what we think we know. And different regions are have different things. Like, so this is bad, right? We expand the space of things that are in the literature that are not true. But here, AI is our friend because it would say, no, that doesn't show up in simulation, and it's right, like it's wrong. This would be a place where it would steer you in the right direction. This is the reverse, right? You're still going in the wrong direction. You're not moving into the green circle. You're writing a paper that's not true. But the AI is going to cheer you along and say, yep, that's what also happens in AI simulation. Here, this one is also AI is harmful because you're pushing into things that are true, but the AI is going to tell you this doesn't work. This is wrong. And then here, it's also helpful. You're pushing into a space of true things, and the AI is going to agree with you. So what is this kind of like? What is the thing that we could move where all of this gets better? Well, it's really, if you could push this up, you can notice like your chance of screwing this up gets smaller, right? You're more likely to be pushing into a good space. Notice also, this actually has something to say about the potential usefulness of replication. If you say you kind of go and double check this, the AI is going to usefully tell you that this is wrong, right? Because it's going to not. This is where the AI is unhelpful to you because it's going to say it's false, but it's actually. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about metaphors from biology and how you're framing this. So like in biology, they often, use animal models before they go to humans. Right? So you have like a mouse model and you have a monkey model.
Fruit fly of
Right, but And, you know, the ones that are further to humans are more like basic research questions that you in drug trials, you might actually put into them, yeah, right? And so we think of these kind of, and then the question, of course, is what, okay, check the box, it works there, now we can go try it in humans, and it seems like it's worth trying, right?
Yeah.
So we're always trying to think of another species of a model for humans to care about humans. And then like a different type of biology would be like, we care about viruses. And we want to understand viruses and how they work so we can stop them, not because they're humans, because you know.
We care about them per
Right.
se.
We're
Yeah.
saying, and sort of veterinarians care about them or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
So they want to help the dog, not use the model. I feel like it's very much in the mouse model of
Yes.
humans thing, but what about, I mean, it seems like you could use the same system to understand AI's behavior itself. And like, I mean, then you don't get an argument about representativeness, like, is it really
That's-
human or
no.
not? I just want to know how AI behaves, if we're using it for all these tasks, I want to experiment on it, make sure it's robust in some way, or it's true, or whatever your criteria is.
Yeah.
It's not gonna hurt us. I
Absolutely.
mean, so it seems like can you use exactly what you're doing in terms of a sort of integrated algorithm to answer those questions as much, or is it sometimes really about mouse models?
Well, no, I'd like to make the broadest possible plan for the impact of my work, but no, I think that, so just, you know, it's a seminar, I can say whatever I want. Like, I actually think that virus thing is gonna be a huge topic in econ and CS, as like we start to have agents that represent us, and we're gonna wanna know, like, do they pass rationality benchmarks? Can I trust them?
Right.
Like, you know, and I think that there's gonna be a ton of work on that. I haven't thought of, I made this on the flight here.
You look kind of like an animal, or.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's like a nice one.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're gonna be, what I think so if I had to like on the fly, I think what we're gonna have is something like this green circle would be like what we would want from our like ideal agent, or like who always represents us perfectly, is a faithful agent, can do unlimited calculation, always gets the right information. And like we know any actual agent that we make is going to deviate from that, but we're like trying to push closer to that ideal. That ideal agent might be like very unhuman like. But we want to understand its properties, because like we want to be able to like give some guarantee, like, you know, it's not going to go and, you know, trade away, you know, all my possessions or something, or turned into a money pump. And so I think it's going to be more of like an engineering question than a science question. Right? A mix of both. Yeah.
Well, thanks for presenting your model. I'm thinking about how this would actually move up and to the left, as you indicated, because I feel like if you don't know whether or not the model has a good world model, you don't know which quadrant they're in, essentially. So epistemically, you don't know if the simulation is steering you in the right direction or the wrong direction. So you could get some additional information on it if you knew it had a good world model for the following sets of questions.
Yes. Yeah.
But I see already that there are going to be some things where the model has a good world model, even some of the economics related questions that you're simulating, whereas in my world of communication, I think there's maybe a smaller set of questions where it's going to have a good world model.
So I agree. So I think we're always going to be trying to think like, hey, do we have the agents and models that we need for the domain that we're interested in? And we'll have like, hey, these things are terrible at representing, you know, behavior X, but they're great at behavior Y, or when we think human behavior is governed by these things, it works really well, but not in these others. But I think what we want to do, hold on. I thought I had a slide. Sorry. Okay, so what I think we want to do is, I think we want to take like, say some things that like some stakes in the ground, you know, are true from your domain. Right, like this is how people behave. I'm very, very confident. And you want to take, like, here's some other domain. Another example of this. It's not exactly the same, but I think the same theory would govern behavior. Is that like enough of what, like you can imagine that, what I'm proposing? And so I think what you would want to do is, you would perturb and play around and fine tune your agents and do whatever you want, data mine the heck out of it for one scenario. And then you're gonna kind of validate on this other. You're gonna see like, hey, have I done a good job of creating agents that their behavior translates to this other? The same like ML concerns about overfitting apply, right? It's like if, imagine I'm doing some game where the outcome is a number. I can always like perfectly match the training by, you're the agent that always says 7, you're the agent that always says 5. And then I can perfectly match the data, but instead of do really poorly in that other like sort of conceptually related domain. So I think that there's, what you're going to be doing is trying to build agents that are robust across different scenarios by kind of doing the ML trick of like, well, we'll train here and we'll leave one out in this other. And you're never going to get statistical guarantees because like mechanically it's a different data generating process. Like that's kind of the whole point. You don't know it's exactly going to be the same as the thing you had before. But by doing that, I think you could create agents that you started to have more confidence, like, hey, these work. This captures how people, tweet on Twitter or something like that. It's all about. But again, remember the point is not to say, now I've got this agent, I'm going to add it to my body of knowledge. You're going to use it to make predictions. Ideally, to guide for empirical, or if you make predictions. Yeah.
Just coming off that, it kind of just seems like a confusion for this results, so like false positives, false negatives, and accuracy on the diagram.
Yep.
Which works really well, very well understood data sets. So are you proposing this would exist properly in more iterative exploration or of tangential related activities, or do how do people perform in something a bit more novel or a bit more divergent from?
I mean, my suspicion is, when this will generalize well is when you have a reasonable belief that this new phenomena that you're interested in is covered by like whatever that same theory is. You may not know what it is yet, but there is like some theory, and you build agents that capture that logic in some way. So, like if we were going back to say like the auction example, I could describe in natural language exactly how you play that game. Right, like if it's a sending price auction, you should pay attention. As soon as the price gets, above your reservation price, you should drop out. I could have like a little behavioral program. All right, and that's what my agent is. And that happens to be like the right theory for that agent. And I bet that would generalize really well. Like you could change the reservation price. You could probably even, if you wrote it at a high enough level of abstraction, maybe it would work in other auction formats. Like if it had enough of that logic. So I think that somewhat ironically, even though we kind of described this as like this empirical exercise, my guess is that the prompts that we'll end up writing that will be very general will essentially just be theories or like rich descriptions of human behavior that we think have somehow captured what people do in that situation. And then, but to your point, like my auction theory description, might be very, very poorly if I'm saying, okay, now, decide how, you're going to search for a job or something. There's all this kind of auction prompt that doesn't sort of really help you. I mean, the most extreme version, as you could imagine, like something that is essentially like almost like an oracle prompt that just really describes my behavior, right? Like if you could capture how I do things in my life and the decisions I make with like a long enough prompt, you could probably make a pretty good model of right? And that's kind of, I think, I'm getting into science fiction stuff. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Well, this diagram is beautiful, by the way. It's great.
Thank you.
Generative. I was wondering about like the role of fact checking. Like if say I have one more prompt and say don't hallucinate fact checking stuff.
Oh yeah.
Does that immediately eliminate? Well, first of all, then this is no longer an oval. It's going to overfit on the social science literature. Is that going to eliminate the bottom place?
So yeah. I mean, I think what you want to do is you want like a lot of ovals where you're kind of shaking it around and like, this is this model, this is this model. And hopefully, like, I think you would hope is that, if we were really lucky, maybe everyone is sort of wrong in an idiosyncratic way, and any particular oval I drew sometimes had this space, but like collectively, it was mostly concentrated on things that are true. But I don't think we have any guarantees that that's true, because you can imagine like a lot of the language models just kind of converging on the same wrong things, right? And
Yeah, that's true, but I was thinking that, because I was bothered by, I think the, out of the 4 legs that you build here, is really the 3rd leg that I don't like. I think the other legs are okay. I think that's the problem.
yeah,
right?
that's terrifying.
But to me, it's like, oh, but if this is hallucination problem, maybe, because if I
Yeah.
ask it to overfit on the literature and say, absolutely, fact check this, give me references, all those prompts that we have used.
Yeah.
Then is that like gonna be eliminated? And then the other 3 likes is
You
okay.
mean this one?
Yeah, because that's the like I don't want, right?
Yeah, that's
Any other like seems like business as usual, the known unknowns and unknown unknowns and these are fine, right? And to me, it's like, is that it's gonna extend us to a harmful way? But then I was like, yeah, is that just a fact checking then? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is like, if you might think of this as like the hallucination
At least part of it, right?
zone, and that if you had better models, right, they had a better world model, better, like, yeah, you would be shrinking that space and you're less likely to do this. Yeah, I think that's the goal. Okay. What time did we go?
Another 4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes, right, okay. So this is, let me just really quick, this is the Ocrea paper. You have to, anyway, this 4-fold pattern is the prospect theory pattern. This is with different language models. This is the GPT-4o. A straight line here just means expected utility maximizer. So it replicates with these are all simpler models. It shows that bias. And then when you tell it, you just say, hey, you're bad at math. The pattern comes back. Let me just say one more thing. If you said, I need to sell my car next week, Anonymous, do you have any advice? We might say, well, we've got some models of bargaining, but we probably are not going to be able to tell you much practically. You're probably better off talking to a lawyer or like a negotiation expert or something like that. Like, I'm not running down economists too much, but a little bit, like, we probably wouldn't have any practical advice, or not much. And this is, I think an embarrassment of being in the social sciences is that you look at a lot of the physical sciences and they can make these very, very sharp predictions. Right? And then, you get to the social science and we kind of say, well, it depends, and there's all these factors. Well, in this system, the theories were super simple, right? We built by design, we didn't have unlimited budgets. But you can imagine, back to Ryan, like you said, like how many, what did you do to constrain it? It's like, yeah, we only allowed this many causes, there was no intermediate causes, et cetera. You could imagine if you had an unlimited budget and an unlimited ability to keep running experiments, you could end up building a very complex applied theory that would be something like, well, here you've activated the node for car bargaining, and like here's a whole bunch of other factors that might matter in a car bargaining situation, but the theory doesn't really, if you're talking about like a house, it's quite different. My point just being, you could imagine using this to generate theories that were capable of making predictions that would have some of the richness of the real world, but still with every path identified, and not subject to this like Lucas critique. This is not just correlations; it would be estimated on the result of doing tons and tons of actual experimental simulations. So, what you might hope is if you can get better at this. Oh, I did have this slide. So you were asking like how you might do this, well. I think what we will do, I imagine is, we'll do something where we refine surveys or experiments and simulation. We kind of do this step in our laptop and try to get good approximations. And then we ultimately have to go to the real world and try it out with actual people. And maybe what we'll do is we'll say, well, this kind of question, the AI and the human might be totally nailed it. But for question number 2, our models don't do that well, or our agents are bad in some sense, and I have to oversample people to actually find out what's going on. So I don't have to necessarily take every part of every step that you created with humans. I could, in some sense, dynamically find out when I'm really off. If I could do that, then we're kind of this process of going back and forth of trying to make our AI agents more similar to the humans that we ultimately care about. I know that this is like very, very high level, but like this is kind of what I think you would do in practice if you were trying to make agents look more like the people you're actually interested in studying. And so if you do that, you know, you push out this boundary. And that I think ultimately is the goal. Thank you.